Yo, what's up, everybody? It is so good to connect with you after what's been an intense election. I'm going to be doing a lot more of these interactions with you via video. Some will take conversations, they'll take different forms. But I thought it's important for us to be able to speak about the state of our nation, where it's going, some of the issues that we're faced up with, and for me to be able to have a conversation with you. So let me begin with the first. Everyone has been asking me a little bit about Pastor Mboro. And I think part of the question is informed by my own background in ministry, but also what it means when you have a leader like Pastor Mboro who do the actions that he does. For those of you who don't know, Pierre is a pastor. He doesn't come with the best reputation. He goes to a school. I must confess, I don't know all the facts about why, but the video that surfaces is him wielding a sword in a school, literally being violent in a community. The subsequent action is the community taking matters into their own hand by setting his church alight. Now, there are a couple of things. One, I think Mboro is wrong. Biblically, you can't make the case to say that you should be advancing violence. His actions provoked violence. It was the worst way to handle the situation. Whatever the facts are, no one should be allowed to go and attack other citizens like that, certainly not in the name of God. I reject that idea. And I know Christianity has had history, and many people might talk about violent acts by Christians, etc. But seriously, this is not one of those. This is an incident where an individual who has a checkered past acts in religious clothing, but takes actions that are inconsistent with the faith, I believe. And I think all of us must be right. We should condemn that. But equally so, mob justice is a way of taking away the power of the law in this country. One of the problems that we face as a society is that we've got to restore our ability to have laws and have them applicable to everybody. An eye for an eye always leads a nation blind. So we can talk about this idea of almost what other people talk about, redemptive justice, this idea that sometimes when you commit an act against me, I will commit one back, and so we just keep going. But that's not helpful. That doesn't heal a society. Imagine if a country, all of its own, said, okay, for every act that someone takes, there must be commensurate action or concomitant action furthermore, and more we keep escalating violence because violence always goes up. He goes to the school with a sword, the community shows up to burn the church. What is the next thing he decides to do, etc.? I think mob justice has not aided us. What we've got to do is capacitate our law enforcement agencies to make sure that the law is applicable to everybody. And I do think, I've been asked the question, well, how do we regulate such fake pastors? We talk about Bushiri and we talk about so many others. I maintain that the church is its best guardian of itself, right? When a business does something dodgy, we don't suddenly discredit the entire business community. Just like when a church does something dodgy, we don't just say the whole church must be like dodgy and we must now create another law enforcement agency. What we generally tend to do is to ask a body of religious leaders to be able to gather together to create norms and standards so that tomorrow no pastors are able to just simply call themselves pastors because they woke up in the morning thinking that. And furthermore, have practices that are inconsistent with the biblical foundations we hold on to. So I want to urge that this is also not just a moment for law enforcement agencies to act, but it's also a moment for the church to be able to step up and say, along with the bishops, whether the Methodist, the Anglican, the Evangelicals, the African traditional churches, etc., to come together to be able to say, how do we create a type of ombudsman, a body that is able to say, how do we monitor what churches do? Because tomorrow it's another person telling people snakes will heal them and another feeding people grass, etc., etc. These are not the things that are consistent with our faith, and ultimately it needs for the church to self-regulate and for the state to be able to say, how do we work with that institution to protect citizens from violence on either end? So with that in mind, I want to just quickly touch base a little bit about how Parliament has been. So yeah, we got sworn in. It was good. It was fascinating. Parliament itself is a different space now. You know, I worry sometimes about the nature of how Parliament is forming itself. There are effectively three caucuses. There's the GNU caucus, there's what is the Progressive caucus, which is EFF-MK, And then ultimately there's the centrist caucus, which is, I think, parties like ourselves who hold values of multiracialism, Ubuntu, the idea of a mixed economy, and that actually we could figure out the best pathways to build an inclusive growth. And I'm finding more and more as I'm being in Parliament, the debates sometimes are bastardizing terms like progressive, so as to suggest that to be anti-West and to suggest pro-black without defining either of those terms is progressive. I actually think that the idea of the fight for the inclusion of black South Africans into the economy broadly is a struggle we should all be waging, because it's good for all of society, for all of South Africans to prosper together. So to relegate that agenda to parties that, for some of them, given the allegations of corruption, etc., have done worse to regress that struggle is a little bit, for me, something that we've got to fight for. But also understanding that establishing the GNU can't just be a matter of the existential threat that it says if parties like this don't work together, well, those will come together. That's a dangerous position in and of itself. It needs to be able to define an agenda that goes forward. And that's why as Build One South Africa, I've always been, let's call for a dialogue. Not just any other dialogue, but let's be clear about what are we trying to do for South Africa. We've got to see a different South Africa 30 years from now, 5 years from now, where indicators are telling us that we face profound crises. We face high levels of unemployment. We've got too many young people who can't find jobs. We've got an education crisis looming. And more than anything, our citizens are not safe. So given those, how do we achieve a society that we can say, let's grow this, let's grow our economy, let's be deliberate about interventions that we use to intervene in the economy so that more and more people can participate? How do we fix our education system so that actually more and more young people are getting a quality education? And I'll come back to that in a moment. And lastly, how do we become more and more intentional about having ethical leaders who are able to steer the interests of all South Africans? If the center doesn't hold, we are going to end up with a society that polarizes, and the danger we face as a country is that we can all regress back to our racial, cultural, religious lagers and ignore the ultimate reason and I think the beauty of this country, which is that together we can prosper together. To my own personal role, I have been elected to be the chair of the Standing Committee on Appropriations. Yep. People say, what does that do? Well, that's the committee that looks at the budget of the country. I was fascinated that, in fact, if you look at the sixth administration, more than half the bills that were passed by the previous administration all had to come through the Appropriations Committee. So it is just objectively the busiest committee in Parliament. And I'd like to think it is the committee that makes sure that there's use of state resources is done properly and it meets its objectives. So it's been an interesting journey. I've been working across multi-parties, and we had our first job, which is to make sure that this current appropriations bill that empowers the state to be able to spend in the next administration is met. And so we fought hard to make sure that the appropriations is put together and that the government is empowered with a proper budget that works in the next number of months. And then in February next year, a budget will be tabled to which we'll begin the work now in giving oversight to that. There are some things that are interesting to me sitting in the committee. For example, we spent 60% on the social wage bill, which tells you that in an economy that has been growing at only 1% for the last 10 years, our social wage bill is not something that's sustainable. It's clear that we're spending too much money on paying off debt. So our debt servicing costs are high. And more than anything, we need to figure out quite quickly, how do we do more growth initiatives and fund for infrastructure? Along with the other difficulties, such as why is money being sent back from municipalities that are weak? How do we do better at making sure that the state's ability to spend aligns with its objectives from each department, that we can use the government's procurement budget to in fact stimulate local economies? So whether it's the health department purchasing of needles, those can't be imported but rather be manufactured here, so we can stimulate that. Whether it's any other type of procurement that occurs, must ensure that it brings developmental objectives. So I'm looking forward to the next administration, because we'll be looking at more of how we can use the budget to better people's lives and to make sure that the objectives are met. And then lastly, I want to encourage you to say that more than anything, we now have the tough job of fixing our education system. And so in a number of conversations we'll be talking, and I spent just even this day, going to Maibuye, a school that was built in Maibuye community, just near Rabi Ridge, Midrand area in Johannesburg, if you know the area. But here's the thing. It's a school that was built on a swamp. 82 million rands was spent. The school is a construction site. It was opened with fanfare on the 7th of February. And we were told more than anything that this is now ready for occupation. We went to the school a number of years back, and we know that it was built on a swamp. I opened a public protector complaint on it. The public protector got back to us to say, hold on, that school was built in the wrong place. A task team needed to be put in place to make sure that funds were managed properly. And then I'm asking them to recoup the funds from the previous administrator. And 4 years later, the school is still a construction site. The toilets don't work. And I felt two things when I was there. Now, because this is a conversation between you and I, one is there's something that must concern me, that an organization like AfriForum can build a university at 300 million and it's world class and its infrastructure and its building. Yet the state in a community like Maibuye spends 82 million rands and delivers such shoddy, poor, unsafe, undignified work. It does bring a sense of shame. It says to us that we are okay with our communities in Maibuye attending schools where really the infrastructure is appalling. And that the plight of black kids in some ways must be in such a place where they arrive to schools that are substandard. This is new infrastructure. So this is not a money problem. It's a leadership excellence problem. We got to build schools that kids that must be better than any private school. A building in its quality, in its modern technology, building in and of itself, technology, all of those things is becoming cheaper in some instances, but we can be able to match the standards. Just because it's in a township does not make it weak, bad, or poor infrastructure. So as many of you know, I'll be going back to not only the Appropriations Committee. I've asked my colleague Ayanda Ali to go to the Gauteng Department of Education and make sure the task team is working, that actually we can recoup the funds, that the contractor is held accountable. But I'll be going to national government to ask, what is our vision for education? Are we going to keep passing kids at 30%? Are we going to ask better of ourselves to have quality teachers who can deliver better education? And can we ensure that when we build infrastructure, we get value for money and that the standards are better than anywhere else? So I'm hoping that as we go and we fight, as Build One South Africa, and my role as a member of parliament is not just to just go to parliament and whatever, but I want to be the best that I can be so that we can build a nation we can all look back at 30 years from now and say, what a different South Africa we live in. That's more inclusive, that is more one. So I look forward to further conversations with you. Let's keep the conversation. Much love. Sharp.